Let's cross over to New York. We're joined by the founder of StopImperialism.com, Mr. Eric Dretzer. Thank you so much for being with us. Well, I guess if anyone is watching this closely, what's happening in Syria since the Russians have started their airstrikes, and compare it to 1 year of the Americans and their so-called airstrikes against Daesh, perhaps many would be confused with the difference. Moscow has been very, very successful on the ground. Do you think with this, as far as the air bombings by Russian aircraft, that many of those perhaps who did not understand the situation are getting it now that the United States has not really been serious about stopping Daesh and other terrorists?
Well, I suppose it would depend on who you mean and whether or not you think that they're getting that information from Western media sources. Because if you were to follow the corporate media in the US or in Europe, you would not get a sense of exactly what Russia is doing in Syria. You would get a sense that Russia is involving itself in an indigenous civil war specifically to prop up a government that is allied to Moscow, which is, of course, the very limited discourse that one receives or engages in the West. There is very little discussion of exactly what Russia's true objectives in Syria are, namely the destruction and dismantling of terrorist infrastructure, ISIS, as well as Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda factions, the so-called Islamic Army of Conquest, Ahrar al-Sham, and all of these other factions. Russia really makes very little distinction between these different groups, and certainly is not buying into this vacuous rhetoric that the United States has been employing with regard to so-called moderate rebels. And much of that is really sort of eliminated or systematically omitted from the discourse in the West. And so I think that a casual news observer would really only have a very superficial understanding of what Russia's actually doing. And there's, of course, a very specific reason for that, because if one is to penetrate the narrative and to really interrogate not only what Russia's objectives are, but also those of Washington and its allies in France, in the UK, in Israel, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and so forth, then a much different picture begins to emerge, specifically that of a Western-sponsored, internationalized war against the Syrian government and Syrian people for the purposes of destroying the state using terrorism. And of course, Russia's involvement now is making the regime change strategy that Washington and NATO have been pursuing really an impossibility. And
Well,
that
what about that,
difficulty.
Eric? I'm sorry to jump in, but what about that? You talked about Russia being involved now basically makes it impossibility for the regime change. Do you think that the United States and its allies, that they were taken off guard? Do you think that they really did not anticipate the Russians getting involved in this way?
No, no doubt about it. I think that if you were to follow the trajectory of this conflict as I have, you would see that the United States and its allies, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the rest of them, believed for a long time, up until very recently, that they could almost literally bleed the country and break it down over a long period of time. I think they were taken off guard by the resistance that the Syrian government put up. I think they were taken certainly off guard recently by Russia's involvement. To at least for the last 25 years, the US and NATO have banked on the fact that they can impose military dominance and hegemony unopposed. And Russia's involvement in Syria, unlike in Libya, for instance, which presents a very interesting contrast, unlike in Libya, Russia's direct involvement in Syria has now taken the military and political initiative out of the hands of Washington and placed it much more broadly within the international community, because what Russia's trying to do is internationalize the political mediation of this conflict. They want to bring the parties to the table, and they want to back, using military force, back a political solution rather than allowing Washington to impose its will politically, diplomatically, and militarily using this asymmetrical, irregular warfare and terrorist proxy forces. That's the strategy in Washington, the counter strategy in Moscow, and that's why you see such dissonance between the White House and its military top brass and the CIA and the rest of the Washington apparatus.
Thank you so much for being with us, Mr. Eric Dretzer, founder of StopImperialism.com out of New York.